Kane Matthews thought the falling snow would bury his sins under a pristine white sheet. He stood in the desolate, frozen alleyway, looking down at Saniyah Daniels' unconscious form with a smug, cold satisfaction. Her black waitress uniform was stark against the frost, her voluminous curls matted against the ice, and her breathing was shallow, a barely visible puff of steam against the biting winter air. Kane wiped the fresh blood from his knuckles onto his ripped jeans, convinced that by morning, Saniyah would be nothing more than a tragic headline, a hardworking waitress who slipped in the freeze and never woke up. But as Kane turned to retreat into the shadows, a sudden, primal chill bypassed the sub-zero wind. He felt it before he saw it, the weight of a gaze so heavy it felt like a physical strike. Just 30 feet away, illuminated by the ghostly amber glow of an idling black SUV, stood a man who didn't belong in the cold. Han Seok, a formidable Korean Mafia boss, watched with a predatory seriousness that made Kane's heart stop. Han Seok was there by accident. He was going to his restaurant to look at stuffs that should be renovated. Kane didn't know it yet, but the moment he raised his hand against the woman who kept Han Seok's restaurant running was the moment his own life ended. He thought he was the predator of this alley, but he was currently standing in the crosshairs of a man who turned blood money into cold-blooded justice. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Han Seok did not move. He remained leaned against the leather interior of the SUV, his dark eyes fixed on the pathetic figure of Kane Matthews through the crystalline veil of falling snow. To Han Seok, the world was a series of ledgers, orderly columns of assets, liabilities, and the occasional irritating error that needed to be erased. Kane was a persistent error. Han Seok recognized the man instantly. He was the primary source of the uncollectible debt, at the Obsidian, Han's high-end bar 3 blocks away. For months, Han had watched the surveillance feeds of Kane stumbling through the doors, smelling of cheap rye and desperation, racking up a tab that his pockets could never satisfy. But seeing him here, standing over a broken woman in the snow, shifted Kane's status from a mere financial nuisance to a moral deficit. Then, Han's gaze drifted to the woman. The amber glow of the headlights caught the sharp line of her high cheekbones and the matted texture of her natural curls, now beginning to gather a thin dusting of frost. Saniyah Daniels. Han didn't need a dossier to know her name. She was the asset, the most efficient waitress at his flagship restaurant, the one who never missed a shift and handled the most volatile customers with a grace that bordered on the supernatural. He had watched her from the shadows of the VIP booths for a year, admiring the quiet strength in her eyes, never realizing that the sadness he detected was the result of the parasite currently standing over her. A slow, cold fury settled in Han's chest. The symmetry was offensive. His best employee was being dismantled by his worst debtor. Kane began to back away, his boots crunching loudly in the silence. He looked at the SUV, then at the motionless man behind the glass, and finally at the blood on his own hands. The icy blue of Kane's eyes darted wildly, searching for an exit that didn't involve passing the predator in the black car. "Boss, should we?" the driver whispered, his hand hovering near the door handle. "No," Han Seok replied, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Let the rat run. He has nowhere to go that I do not already own. The snow will track him for us." As Kane turned and bolted into the white haze of the blizzard, Han Seok stepped out of the vehicle. The cold didn't seem to touch him. He walked toward Saniyah, his handmade leather shoes barely making a sound on the ice. He looked down at her, the small scar on her wrist, the stained apron, the resilience that was currently being tested by the elements. She was a valuable part of his empire, and Han Seok never let his property go to waste. He reached down, his gloved hand moving with a clinical, protective gentleness to check the pulse at her throat. "The ledger is out of balance, Saniyah," he murmured to the unconscious woman. "Let's fix it." The heavy, clinical silence of the private hospital suite was broken only by the rhythmic, artificial hum of the heart monitor. Saniyah Daniels lay beneath bleached white sheets, her dark brown skin a stark contrast to the sterile environment. Han Seok stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the snow continue to blanket the city in a deceptive peace. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man auditing a high-stakes investment. When the lead physician entered, Han didn't turn around. "Status," Han commanded. "Concussion, 2 cracked ribs and localized bruising. But she's strong, Mr. Han. Her body is recovering faster than expected, though her nutritional markers suggest chronic stress. Long-term exhaustion." Han's jaw tightened. Exhaustion wasn't a medical condition in his world. It was a symptom of a parasite. "Keep her in the VIP wing. I want the best neurologists, and under no circumstances is her name to appear on the public registry." The doctor bowed and exited, leaving Han alone with the woman who had spent the last 3 years of her life being drained of her light. He moved to the side of the bed, his gaze falling on her left wrist. He gently pulled back the sleeve of the hospital gown, revealing the small scar she usually kept hidden. It was a permanent mark of a previous trauma, a silent testament to the resilience he had admired from afar in his restaurant. "You've been paying for a drunkard's anchor, Saniyah," he murmured, his voice cutting through the hum of the machines. He recalled the confession she had whispered in her semi-conscious state during the drive, the jagged, broken sentences about rent money, the years of covering Kane's, outstanding bills at his own bars, and the job Kane lost because he preferred the bottom of a bottle to a hard day's work. Saniyah had been the engine of their lives, while Kane had been the rust destroying the machinery. Han reached into the pocket of his charcoal overcoat and pulled out a slim, encrypted phone. He sent a single message to his head of security: "Begin the audit on Kane Matthews. I want every debt, every legal infraction, and every person he's ever crossed. He's no longer a debtor, he's a deficit." As he looked back at Saniyah, her eyelids fluttered. She was coming back to a world that had been cruel to her, but she didn't know the ledger had shifted. She didn't know that the man standing in the shadows wasn't just her boss. He was the one who was about to make sure Kane Matthews paid his debt in a currency more valuable than money. "Rest," Han said softly, his predatory seriousness replaced by a cold, protective resolve. "The storm is over for you. It's just beginning for him." The air inside the obsidian was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the underlying metallic tang of cold authority. Unlike the snowy chaos outside, the bar operated with the silent, pressurized efficiency of a deep-sea vessel. Behind the bar, the rows of crystal bottles gleamed like a laboratory, but the man sitting at the far end of the mahogany counter wasn't there for a drink. Han Seok rotated a heavy tumbler of ice, the cubes clicking against the glass with a sound like a ticking clock. He didn't look up when the manager of the establishment, a man who had seen the worst of the city's underbelly, approached with a leather-bound folder. "The audit is complete, Mr. Han," the manager whispered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the ventilation. Han set the glass down. "Give me the numbers." Kane Matthews, outstanding bar tab 12,000, gambling markers from the back room 24,000, late fees and interest another 10. The manager paused, sliding a series of grainy photographs across the bar. "But the financial debt isn't the issue. We've tracked his movements over the last 48 hours. He's been frequenting the low-end dens in the outskirts, trying to leverage your name to get credit. He's telling people he's untouchable because he knows the layout of your restaurant." Han's eyes darkened, the predatory seriousness returning with a cold, sharp edge. It was one thing to be a debtor. It was another to be a leak. Kane wasn't just a parasite on Saniyah. He was a liability to the internal security of Han's empire. "He thinks his proximity to the asset gives him leverage," Han said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "He thinks because he knows where Saniyah works, he knows me. He attempted to return to the bar an hour ago, boss. He was looking for a loan to get out of the city. He looked, panicked. There was salt on his boots and blood on his collar." Han stood up, his tailored charcoal suit catching the dim light of the bar. He adjusted his silk tie with a clinical precision. "He isn't leaving this city, not until the ledger is balanced. He owes for the drinks, he owes for the markers, and now he owes for the damage to my most valuable employee." Han walked toward the back office, his stride measured and purposeful. "Contact the collection team. Tell them I don't want his money anymore. I want his presence. Find out which hole he's crawled into to hide from the snow and wait. I want him to feel the chill of the debt before we collect it." As the manager bowed, Han looked at the security monitors. One screen showed the quiet, snowy street outside. Another showed the VIP hospital wing where Saniyah was still fighting for her breath. The debt was no longer just business. It was personal. And in Han Seok's world, personal debts were paid in blood. The discharge from the hospital felt like stepping into a different world, though the frost-covered streets of the city remained as unforgiving as ever. Saniyah stood before her apartment door, her breath hitching as she fumbled with her keys. Her ribs ached with a dull, throbbing reminder of Kane's boots, and the quiet of the hallway felt heavy, pregnant with the fear that he might be waiting behind the wood. When she finally pushed the door open, the apartment was cold and silent. It was a space defined by absence, the absence of her rent money, the absence of her peace, and the absence of the man who had systematically dismantled her life. She sank onto her small velvet sofa, her natural curls spilling over her shoulders as she pulled a throw blanket tight around her slim frame. She felt small, a distressed victim in a city that usually ground people like her into the slush. She didn't know that 3 floors down, a nondescript black van was idling in the snow. Inside, 2 men in tactical gear watched a thermal feed of her living room. "Asset is stationary," one whispered into a headset. "She's safe." Saniyah stared at her phone. No calls, no texts from the restaurant. She assumed she had been fired for missing her shift, another casualty of Kane's volatile wake. The quiet sadness in her deep brown eyes deepened as she calculated the days until eviction. She had no way of knowing that her medical bills had already been settled by an anonymous corporate entity, or that the fragile recovery she was experiencing was being curated by a man who treated her safety as a matter of state security. As she drifted into a restless sleep, she dreamt of the ghostly amber glow of headlights in the snow and a voice that sounded like silk and iron. Outside, the wind howled, but the perimeter around her building was impenetrable. Han Seok had placed a fortress of glass around her, invisible and absolute. Every exit was monitored, every shadow was vetted. While Saniyah mourned the life she thought she had lost, Han Seok was busy ensuring that the variables remained in her favor. She was being monitored for safety, but more than news, that she was being prepared for a transformation. The waitress who walked home in the snow was gone. The woman who would stand beside the boss of the city was beginning to wake up. The ledger was open, and the first entry of her new life had already been written in the silent, watchful dark. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant felt like the entrance to a past life as Saniyah stepped inside. The warmth of the interior, smelling of roasted garlic and expensive wine, was a jarring contrast to the lingering chill in her bones. Her coworkers moved with a hushed, frantic energy, but as soon as she was spotted, the floor went silent. She felt the weight of their stares, pity mixed with a strange, new kind of reverence. Before she could reach the lockers, the manager, Mr. Henderson, intercepted her. Usually a man of rigid schedules and sharp critiques, he looked uncharacteristically nervous. His hands slightly shook as he held a small, cream-colored envelope. "Saniyah," he began, his voice lacking its usual bite. "The owner. He was very concerned about your absence. He's reviewed your performance logs and the circumstances of your accident on the night of the storm." Saniyah braced herself, her fingers tracing the hidden scar on her wrist. "I can explain the shift, Mr. Henderson. I just need—" "You don't need to explain anything," he interrupted, sliding the envelope into her hand. "The owner doesn't believe in losing his most valuable assets to outside variables. He's adjusted your compensation to reflect your true worth to this establishment. Consider this a restoration of the ledger." With trembling fingers, Saniyah pulled out the check. Her breath caught. The figure was 4 times her original monthly salary, a windfall that didn't just cover her rent, but wiped away the shadow of bankruptcy Kane had cast over her. It was a rebirth check, a financial shield that made her no longer vulnerable to a drunkard's whims. "There's more," Henderson added, stepping aside. "You're being moved to the VIP floor effective immediately. Higher stakes, higher security, and a direct line to the executive office. He wants you where the light is brightest. Saniyah looked at the check, then at the empty, snowy street through the window. The quiet sadness in her eyes was momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope, a realization that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was being built into something untouchable. "Who is he?" she whispered. "The owner. I've worked here for a year and I've never seen him." "You'll meet him soon enough," Henderson replied, a look of profound relief crossing his face. "He's a man who values precision, and right now he's finishing some business involving a certain outstanding debt." Saniyah clutched the check to her chest. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel thin. She was standing on solid ground, unaware that the man who had signed that check was currently watching her through the security feed, his predatory seriousness softening into a look of cold, dark satisfaction. The asset was back in place. Now it was time to remove the parasite. The lunch rush had subsided into a low, sophisticated hum, but the air in the restaurant suddenly grew heavy, as if the atmospheric pressure had dropped before a strike of lightning. Saniyah, now dressed in a pristine, higher-quality uniform provided by the house, was polishing a crystal flute when the front doors swung open. The staff straightened instinctively. The rhythmic, measured click of expensive leather against the hardwood floor announced a presence that demanded the room's oxygen. Han Seok stepped into the light, draped in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the glow of the chandeliers. He was lean, powerful, and carried an aura of quietly menacing authority. Saniyah froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with the jagged fear Kane inspired, but with a profound, vibrating recognition. Those were the eyes from the hospital shadows. That was the silhouette from the snowy alley. Han Seok didn't head for the VIP booths. He walked directly toward the bar where Saniyah stood. He stopped 3 feet away, his dark, calculating gaze sweeping over her, noting the healthy color returning to her dark brown skin and the way she held her head higher. He looked at her with a predatory seriousness that was both unsettling and strangely grounding. "Mr. Henderson tells me the new compensation was satisfactory," Han Seok said, his voice a smooth, low rasp that made the fine hairs on Saniyah's arms stand up. "You," Saniyah whispered, her voice trembling but not breaking. "You're the owner. You were there that night. I own the bar where your ex-boyfriend remains a debtor. I own the restaurant where you are the most valuable asset. And I own the streets where he thought he could discard you like trash." Han Seok leaned in slightly, the faint scent of sandalwood and cold rain clinging to his suit. "In my world, Saniyah, we do not allow our investments to be damaged by broken men." He reached into his pocket and placed a small, heavy object on the mahogany bar. It was a black credit card, unbranded and sleek. "I am Han Seok," he said, the rare, predatory smile touching his lips. "And the man who hurt you is currently learning that some debts cannot be paid in cash. They are paid in years, in sweat, in the absolute loss of one's agency." Saniyah looked from the card to the man who had effectively rebuilt her world in 48 hours. The quiet sadness that had defined her for years flickered and died, replaced by the realization of her new reality. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was under the protection of the most dangerous man in the city. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you didn't break," Han replied, his gaze piercing. "And because I've decided that the variables in this city will, from this moment forward, always remain in your favor." As he turned to leave, his security detail stepped into formation behind him, measured, purposeful, and silent. Saniyah watched him go, finally understanding that the fortress of glass wasn't a prison. It was a throne. And for the first time in her life, the ledger was not just balanced, it was overflowing. The extraction began not with a bang, but with the terrifying, silent precision of a closing trap. Kane Matthews was huddled in a dilapidated basement apartment on the edge of the industrial district, the air smelling of damp concrete and cheap whiskey. He was counting the crumpled bills he had managed to scrounge, barely enough for a bus ticket out of the city, let alone the thousands he owed the syndicate. He jumped at every creak of the floorboards, his icy blue eyes bloodshot and darting toward the single, reinforced door. He didn't hear the door open. He only felt the sudden, violent shift in the room's pressure. Two men in dark, tactical overcoats moved into the light, their faces as expressionless as stone. Before Kane could even reach for the empty bottle on the table, a heavy hand clamped over his mouth, and a knee was driven into his gut with clinical force. He was hauled upward, his feet barely touching the floor, as they dragged him toward the black SUV idling in the snowy alley. He wasn't taken to a police station. He was taken to the annex, a windowless, soundproofed room beneath Han Seok's main corporate office. Han Seok was waiting. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, a tablet in his hand displaying a digital ledger. He didn't look angry. He looked like an accountant who had found a disgusting smudge on a pristine document. "Mr. Matthews," Han said, his voice echoing in the cold room, "you have a variety of debts, financial, moral, and now physical." "I'll pay it back," Kane wheezed, blood trickling from his split lip. "I just need time. Saniyah, she has the money, I can get it from her." The silence that followed was absolute. Han Seok stood up, the movement so fluid it was predatory. He walked over to Kane and gripped his jaw with a gloved hand, forcing him to look up. "You will never speak her name again. You are no longer a man with a name. You are a liability that is being liquidated." Han signaled to his lead head of security. "He has been charged with aggravated assault and grand larceny. The evidence, the dashcam footage, the hospital records, and his unpaid markers has been digitized and sent to the authorities. But before the state takes him, he will sign over every remaining asset he has to the victim's trust." A heavy pen was shoved into Kane's hand. He looked at the documents, a full confession and a transfer of his meager belongings and future wages to a fund in Saniyah's name. "The pen," Han Seok whispered, leaning down to Kane's ear, "or the shovel. Choose, Kane, but know that either way, you are erased from her world." With trembling hands, Kane signed. As the ink dried, Han Seok turned his back on the man, already bored with the persistent error. "Take him to the precinct," Han commanded. "Ensure he stays in general population. I want him to understand exactly what it feels like to be the smallest thing in a very dark room." As Kane was dragged away, screaming for a mercy he had never shown Saniyah, Han Seok adjusted his cuffs. The extraction was complete. The parasite had been removed, and the physical debt was officially in collection. The transition from the recovery bed to the executive suite was not merely a change of scenery. It was a total reconstruction of Saniyah's identity. Within weeks of the extraction, Saniyah found herself living in a high-security penthouse overlooking the city's shimmering, frozen skyline. The apartment was a fortress of iron and gold, designed by Han Seok to be the absolute antithesis of the drafty, fear-filled flat she had shared with Kane. Every morning, a delivery arrived. Tailored blazers in deep plums and charcoal grays, silk blouses that felt like a second skin, and leather portfolios embossed with her initials. Han Seok didn't just give her money. He provided the infrastructure for her to reclaim her mind. He assigned her a private tutor in corporate management and a security detail that moved with a predatory seriousness, ensuring that no shadow in the city could ever touch her again. Saniyah sat at the mahogany desk in her new home, reviewing the restaurant's expansion plans. She was no longer just a waitress. She had been positioned as a lead consultant for Han's hospitality empire. The underlying resilience that had once been used to endure Kane's abuse was now being channeled into a sharp, clinical brilliance. Han Seok visited her once a week. He never crossed the boundary of her personal space, maintaining a respectful, almost clinical protective distance. They would sit by the fireplace, the orange glow reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes as they discussed the balance of the ledger. "You're working too hard, Saniyah," Han remarked one evening, his gaze lingering on the documents spread before her. "I'm working for myself for the first time," she replied, her voice steady and stripped of its old weariness. She looked at him, her warm brown eyes meeting his piercing ones. "You didn't just save me from Kane. You saved me from the version of myself that thought I deserved him." "I merely provided the tools," Han said, his rare, unsettling smile appearing. "The construction of the fortress was entirely your doing." As she watched the snow fall against the reinforced glass windows, Saniyah realized she was no longer looking for exits. The fragile recovery had hardened into an unbreakable strength. She was no longer a distressed victim waiting for the next blow. She was a woman of influence, a pillar of an empire, and the primary interest of the most dangerous man in the city. The transformation was nearly complete. She had moved from the mud of the alleyway to the peak of the mountain, and for the first time, the height didn't make her dizzy. It made her feel powerful. 6 months had passed since the snow had threatened to bury Saniyah Daniels in that desolate alley. Today, the city was in the grip of a different kind of white, the sterile, brilliant light of a high-rise boardroom. Saniyah stood at the head of the mahogany table, closing a folder on the most successful quarterly expansion in the restaurant group's history. She was no longer the woman in the stained apron. She wore a tailored black suit that mirrored Han Seok's own aesthetic, her natural curls styled with a sharp, professional elegance. Her warm brown eyes no longer carried a hint of sadness. They held the calm, lethal gaze of someone who understood exactly how the world's ledgers were balanced. As the executives filed out, a familiar, rhythmic vibration signaled a presence at the door. Han Seok stepped inside, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at her, acknowledging the absolute transformation of the asset he had rescued from the frost. "The numbers are perfect, Saniyah," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "The expansion into the northern district is complete. The variables remained in our favor." "They remained in my favor because I made them," Saniyah replied, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. Han moved closer, stopping at a respectful distance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object, a silver coin embossed with the seal of his syndicate. He placed it on the table between them. "This is the final entry," Han murmured. "Kane Matthews was sentenced this morning to 20 years. His debts to the state are being collected, and his debts to me are finalized. He will never see the sun as a free man again." Saniyah picked up the coin, feeling its cold weight in her palm. It was a talisman of her new life, a physical sign that the parasite had been permanently removed. She looked out the window at the city below. The snow was falling again, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like a clean slate. "The ledger is closed," she said, her voice ringing with a new authority. "Closed," Han agreed, his dark eyes reflecting a rare sense of pride. "But a new book begins today. You are no longer under my protection, Saniyah. You are my partner. And in this city, partners of Han Seok don't just survive. They dominate." Saniyah tucked the coin into her blazer pocket and walked toward the door. As she stepped into the hallway, the security team Han had provided stepped into formation behind her, measured, purposeful, and silent. She didn't look back at the shadows of her past. She was moving toward the light, backed by the most dangerous man in the city, knowing that she was finally, irrevocably, the master of her own destiny.